আসসালামু আলাইকুম দর্শক মণ্ডলী, আপনাদের সকলকে আমন্ত্রণ ক্রিমিনাল জাস্টিস প্রোগ্রাম দেখবার জন্য। আমি আজাম কো সলিসিটরস এর প্রিন্সিপাল সলিসিটর শাফিউল আজম এবং আমার সাথে আছেন আমার কলিগ ডেভিড ওয়ালব্যাংক কিউসি। দর্শক, আপনারা জানেন এখন সারা দেশে আবার লকডাউন শুরু হয়েছে, এই জন্য আমরা রিমোটলি প্রোগ্রাম করতেছি। আমরা স্টুডিওর মধ্যে নাই, আমি এবং আমার কলিগ ডেভিড ওয়ালব্যাংক কিউসি আমরা রিমোটলি আপনার কনফারেন্স কলের মাধ্যমে আমরা এই প্রোগ্রাম আজকে চালাচ্ছি। ক্রিমিনাল জাস্টিস প্রোগ্রাম অনুষ্ঠিত হয় প্রতি রবিবার দুপুর 12:30 থেকে 2টা। রবিবার লাইভ প্রোগ্রাম হয় এবং পরবর্তী মঙ্গলবার দুপুর 12:30 থেকে 2টা প্রোগ্রামটি আবার রিপিট দেখানো হয়। সুতরাং প্রতি রবিবার এবং মঙ্গলবার দুপুর 12:30 থেকে 2টা আপনারা ক্রিমিনাল জাস্টিস প্রোগ্রাম দেখতে পারেন। 2002 সালে আমি আজাম কো সলিসিটরস ফার্ম এস্টাবলিশ করেছি। দীর্ঘ অনেক বছর ধরে আমি ক্রিমিনাল লয়ের উপর প্র্যাকটিস করে আসছি এবং আমার স্পেশালিজম হচ্ছে ক্রিমিনাল লয়ের উপর। তাই এই প্রোগ্রামে আমরা শুধু ক্রিমিনাল ল বিষয়ে আলোচনা করি। কনফিডেন্সিয়ালিটি ব্রিচ হওয়ার রিস্ক থাকে বলে আমরা লাইভ প্রোগ্রামে কোনো প্রশ্ন নিই না। একজন স্পেশালিস্ট ক্রিমিনাল ডিফেন্স সলিসিটর হিসাবে আমি অনেক বছর ধরে ম্যাজিস্ট্রেটস কোর্ট এবং ক্রাউন কোর্টে ছোট বড় অনেক ধরনের কেস করে আসছি। আমি ক্রাউন কোর্টে অনেক হাই প্রোফাইল কেসগুলো আমি করেছি, তাই কমিউনিটির মেম্বারদের কাছ থেকে বিভিন্ন প্রশ্ন আমার কাছে আসে, আর সেই প্রশ্নগুলির উপর গুরুত্ব দিয়ে আমি ক্রিমিনাল জাস্টিস প্রোগ্রামের আলোচনার বিষয়গুলো ঠিক করি। আর আজকের বিষয়ের মধ্যে থাকবে 2টা কেসের উপর আমার কলিগ ডেভিড ওয়ালব্যাংক কিউসি কথা বলবেন। এটা হলো আর ভার্সেস বার্টন এন্ড বুথ এবং ন্যাশনাল ক্রাইম এজেন্সি ভার্সেস হাজে ইয়েভা। এই 2টা কেস খুব গুরুত্বপূর্ণ ল্যান্ডমার্ক কেস, এগুলো ভেরি ইম্পর্টেন্ট কেস। এগুলোর উপরে আমার কলিগ ডেভিড ওয়ালব্যাংক কিউসি বলবেন। We are going to talk about the general principles of criminal law in this program. Every case has its own facts, merits, and demerits. If you are facing a criminal investigation or concerned about something that involves the police, always seek advice from a specialist criminal defense solicitor. সুতরাং পুলিশ যদি আপনাকে অ্যারেস্ট করে পুলিশ স্টেশনে নিয়ে যায় অথবা ফোন করে যদি পুলিশ স্টেশনে যাওয়ার জন্য বলে, তাহলে সাথে সাথে আপনার পছন্দের একজন স্পেশালিস্ট ক্রিমিনাল ডিফেন্স সলিসিটরের সাথে যোগাযোগ করে অ্যাডভাইস নেওয়া উচিত। আমার বক্তব্যগুলো আমি বাংলায় এবং ইংলিশে মিশিয়ে বলার চেষ্টা করব যাতে সবার বুঝতে সুবিধা হয়। Being arrested, being prosecuted, or investigated for a criminal offense can have a huge impact on your personal and professional life.
Yes, so are you ready for my contribution, yeah?
Please, you can continue.
Yeah,
please.
I'll talk about the case of Barton and Booth, if I may, as Shafi has mentioned. And as he said, it's a really important case, probably one of the most important cases decided in the English criminal law, certainly in the last decade or so. It was a judgment that was handed down on the 29th of April of 2020 by the Court of Appeal Criminal Division. And it was so important that it in fact came before a specially constituted, a very unusual Court of Appeal constitution of 5 judges. The Court of Appeal normally has 3 judges. This was a specially constituted 5-judge court, including the Lord Chief Justice, who is the most senior criminal judge in the country, and the president of the Queen's Bench Division of the High Court, and the vice. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, David.
You can hear me? Yes, good, okay.
Yes.
Can I carry on?
Yes, yeah. I think I have come back, but for some reason, my line was disconnected, so I got it back again. I will pass to you in a minute, yeah?
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, yeah. Or you want to start talking on the R versus Burton and Booth case? Yeah?
Yes, I just started on it.
Yeah, it was just sort of problematic here. The line was disconnected. You know, all these technical issues sometimes happen. So you can continue then now. Yeah.
Okay, I was just explaining, Shafi, to your viewers, that having been one of the most important criminal cases decided certainly in the last decade, it had come before a specially constituted court. The Court of Appeal normally has 3 judges. This was a 5-judge court, including the Lord Chief Justice, who's the most senior judge, criminal judge in England, and the President of the Queen's Bench Division of the High Court, which is the main High Court division, and also the Vice President, the number 2, if you like, in the Court of Appeal Criminal Division, Lord Justice Fulford. And the reason that it was so important was it was addressing the question of what dishonesty means in the English criminal law. And it was important for a second reason as well. It was also concerned with what we call the doctrine of precedent, which is the rules which decide which decisions of which courts are the decisions that we have to follow, which are the binding decisions which all the lower courts have to follow. The doctrine of precedent has been described as the very foundation stone of the administration of justice and the rule of law. And in this case, the Court of Appeal actually considered what are the rules of precedent, which cases take priority, which decisions take priority, and why. And on the particular matter of dishonesty in the English criminal law, the Court of Appeal in this case had decided whether it should follow an earlier decision of the Court of Appeal, which had been decided 35 years ago, in about 1985, a case which had been regarded as binding for the last 35 years, or whether it should follow a much more recent decision of the Supreme Court, which is, as you'll know, I'm sure, the very highest court in the land. And the particular issue was whether they should follow the decision of the Supreme Court, which is a higher court, even though, strictly speaking, the question of dishonesty wasn't a question which arose for decision in this most recent judgment of the Supreme Court. So on the rules of precedent, how they'd been understood until now, the fact that the issue hadn't actually been necessary for the Supreme Court's decision would have meant that it wasn't strictly binding on lower courts. So I don't want to get too technical about it. I appreciate this is not a program for lawyers, but essentially what I'm trying to convey to your viewers is this was a really important case for 2 reasons. First of all, because it addressed the whole question of what dishonesty means, and that's obviously going to be important in all sorts of contexts in the criminal law. And secondly, the court was concerned with how those rules of precedent work in practice, which basically tells lawyers which decisions they have to follow and which decisions they can choose not. So with that introduction, can I just say something about the facts of the case, because they were fairly interesting, I think. The facts were that for more than 2 decades, Shafi, a man called David Barton had been running a luxury nursing home called Barton Park in the Birkdale area of Southport in Lancashire. And over that time, over about 20 years or so, he had targeted, he had befriended, and he had groomed, in effect, a very large number of elderly, wealthy, childless, and ultimately rather vulnerable residents of that home, basically in order to steal from them, in order to profit from them at their expense. He had manipulated them, he had isolated them from their families and from their friends and from their professional advisors. A number of the residents had made him the beneficiary of their wills, usually within a short time of arriving at that home. So within a short time of checking into the Barton Park home, they would be making this David Barton the beneficiary of their wills. They allowed him to assume control over their finances. by making him their next of kin, or by granting him power of attorney, or by making him the executor of their wills, or, as I've said, the beneficiary of their wills. And he used all of these steps that they'd taken basically to enrich himself at their expense. He essentially he abused their trust, and he exploited the relationship that he built up with them in a number of different ways. He would obtain very large cash gifts from them. He would obtain effectively bogus loans from them, which weren't loans at all. They were really just transfers of cash. He would charge them fees purportedly for their stay in the home, but at levels which were vastly in excess of what could ever have been regarded as reasonable fees. And sometimes the fees were just entirely fabricated. With some of the residents, he claimed to have negotiated or entered into so-called lifetime agreements, under which they agreed to make a very large upfront payment to him in return for the right to reside in the home for the rest of their natural lives. Again, by way of example, to two of the residents, he actually sold Rolls-Royce motor cars, but for roughly 4 times the true value of the cars that he sold to them. So on the face of it, it was pretty shoddy behaviour. It was really manipulative exploitation of vulnerable people. But the really striking feature of the case was that all of the victims of his behaviour, all of the old people who'd basically handed over money in various ways or been ripped off by him in various ways, all agreed to enter into the transactions. They all had their marbles. In other words, that they all had mental capacity to enter into transactions. They were vulnerable. They were isolated from their families and friends and professional advisors, but they knew what they were doing when they entered into the transactions. There was no suggestion that any of them had been physically mistreated. There was no suggestion that any of them had been neglected as residents in the home. On the contrary, a number of them, before they moved to the Barton Park home, had been living in really unsatisfactory conditions where they'd been badly treated by the people who were running the homes in which they previously lived. And once they moved into Barton Park, they were well looked after, and they were really happy to be there. In fact, they were grateful to this man, David Barton, for taking them in. So your viewers, I think, will be able to see it was an unusual case, because on the one hand, you had a man who was enriching himself at the expense of these old people in various ways. But on the other hand, none of them were actually complaining about it, and they all had mental capacity to enter into the transactions. The matters only came to light in 2014 after one of the residents died. And David Barton issued a civil claim in the name of himself and his wife, Lucinda Barton, and their company, which was called Choice Classic Limited, the company through which they operated the home. And in effect, they issued legal proceedings, a civil action, suing the estate of the resident who had just passed away for what they claimed were fees owing as a result of her lengthy stay at the Barton Park home. Now, whether or not any fees were in fact owing, there is absolutely no doubt that the figure claimed by the Bartons and by their company was massively exaggerated, because their claim was for a sum of approximately £10 million. £10 million in fees they were claiming in relation to this old lady who'd sadly passed away, her stay at the home over a period of years. And your viewers will think, I suspect, unsurprisingly, that the family of the lady in question, the family of the lady who had passed away, were very unhappy about this, thought it was a bit much that David Barton and his wife and their company were claiming £10 million in back fees. and they got the police involved. They asked the police to investigate the Barton Park home and David. And in the course of the police's investigation, it became clear that over a period of 20 years or so that I've mentioned, David Barton had obtained a total of more than £4.1 million from residents, and moreover, he'd managed to accumulate for himself a portfolio of properties, a whole number of properties, 23 properties he'd obtained for himself in the Southport area, all owned either by himself and his wife or by their company. And he treated himself to a whole fleet of luxury cars, including 4 Ferraris, 3 Rolls Royces, 2 high-value Mercedes, and a number of other vehicles besides. And as I mentioned a moment ago, that sort of campaign of acquisition in which he'd engaged had culminated in an attempt by him to obtain a further sum of around £10 million from the estate of one recently deceased resident. Now, after the police investigation, at the conclusion of the police investigation, and as a result of all those matters emerging in the course of the investigation and as a result of the police's inquiries, unsurprisingly, David Barton was arrested. And from May of 2017, he actually stood trial in the Crown Court before a judge and jury. It was in the Liverpool Crown Court, being the local Crown Court for the Southport area in Lancashire. And he stood trial before Judge Everett and a jury. There are a number of other defendants on trial alongside him, including the home's general manager, a lady called Rosemary Booth, and the home's care manager, and the home's registered manager, as well as David Barton's wife, Lucinda, and his 2 sons. There would have been another defendant alongside them. There was a solicitor who had assisted him in all of this activity, but that solicitor died before the trial, so obviously he could not stand trial, but he would have been in the dock had he lived long enough. Before the trial, the bookkeeper for the Barton Park home, a lady called Korea Hughes, actually pleaded guilty to a count of conspiracy to defraud and to a count of false accounting. And she ended up, in effect, doing a deal with the prosecution and ended up giving evidence for the prosecution against David Barton and the others. So she became a prosecution witness. Now, of the defendants, David Barton was obviously the main defendant. He actually gave evidence at the trial, and he said that the money that he had received consisted of gifts from grateful residents. They had, he said, always acted with full capacity. They had, he said, always had the benefit of professional advice. And he claimed that all the fees that he charged were legitimate. There might have been an occasional misunderstanding. There might have been an occasional error, he said, but basically he was acting in good faith and honestly, and all the fees that he charged were legitimate. He said that the civil action, the civil claim that he'd issued, the proceedings that he'd brought against the estate of the recently deceased resident, he said that was brought on legal advice, and it was brought honestly and in good faith. And he said that insofar as any mistakes had been made in relation to the figures that were claimed, remember the £10 million or so that had been claimed, he said that wasn't down to him. Those were errors by the bookkeeper, the lady who'd become a witness for the prosecution. I mentioned that the home's general manager, Rosemary Booth, was also on trial. The prosecution case against her was essentially that she had abused her trusted position as the general manager of Barton Park and as the confidant of a number of the residents. She had, the prosecution said, acted as the eyes and ears of David Barton, doing his bidding, keeping him informed about the residents and so on. She, in her defence, said that while she was responsible for managing the domestic arrangements at Barton Park, she had no responsibility for any of the financial affairs of the home. She knew very little about finance, and she had very limited ability, she said, with computers. And she said she had not been party to any fraud.
We have to go for a short break now,
Okay.
David. We can get back to that point next segment. Yeah, it's a very interesting case. It may be that I think you should be repeating some of these parts of the fact of the case in the next segment again. Yeah, we will get back to that point again. দর্শক, আমরা শর্ট একটা ব্রেকে যাচ্ছি। এটা খুব ইম্পর্টেন্ট, উনি কেসের উপরে আপডেট করতেছেন, যেটা হচ্ছে আর ভার্সেস বার্টন এন্ড বুথ কেস। এটা একটা ল্যান্ডমার্ক কেস অন দ্য ডিসঅনেস্টি টেস্টের উপরে। আমরা আবার আসতেছি, আমরা শর্ট একটা ব্রেকে যাচ্ছি। আমি আজাম এন্ড কো সলিসিটরস এর প্রিন্সিপাল সলিসিটর শাফিউল আজম এবং আমার সাথে আছেন ডেভিড ওয়ালব্যাংক কিউসি। সবাই আমাদের সাথে থাকুন।